For just a moment, imagine you have nothing left. No savings, no safety net, no one calling to check on you. You're standing in front of a house that the whole town has written off. Windows boarded, front porch caved in on one side, a condemned notice stapled to the door like a warning the rest of the world took seriously. But you're not the rest of the world. You're a man who has already lost everything once before and somehow kept moving. And in your coat pocket is a folded envelope with $800 inside. Every single dollar you have left on earth. Most people would walk away, but Ray Calloway wasn't most people. And the decision he made on that cold Tuesday morning in October would not only change the course of his life, it would force him to confront a truth that had been waiting inside those walls for over 40 years. Ray Calloway was 53 years old and living in a rented room above a hardware store in Grover Falls, a small town in rural Tennessee with a population just under 4,000. He had grown up there, left in his 20s chasing work in Louisville, married, had a daughter named Cassie, and then watched that life quietly come apart. The marriage ended, the work dried up, his mother passed in 2019, and when Ray came back to Grover Falls for the funeral, he realized he had nowhere else to go. He found part-time work at a local garage, oil changes, brake jobs, the occasional engine rebuild. He was good with his hands and honest with people. But honesty doesn't always pay the rent on time. By the fall of 2022, Ray had managed to save just over $800, and he had a decision to make about what to do with it. The property at 412 Birchwood Lane had been sitting empty since 1981. The last person to live there was an elderly man named Walter Greer, a recluse by most accounts who had no known relatives and very little contact with anyone in town. When Walter died, the property passed through a tangle of county bureaucracy, unpaid taxes, and legal limbo that lasted for decades. By the time Ray heard about it through a notice posted at the county office, the asking price had been reduced to $850, and the county was willing to negotiate. Ray talked him down to $800 flat. His landlord thought he was losing his mind. His coworker Marcus shook his head and said, "Ray, that place is cursed." But Ray looked at that house and saw something different. He saw the only thing he could still afford to call his own. The first time Ray unlocked the front door and stepped inside, the smell hit him before anything else. Damp wood, old paper, and something underneath it all that he couldn't quite name. Decades of sealed air releasing all at once, like the house had been holding its breath. The floors were warped but solid. The walls were stained but standing. Someone, Walter presumably, had stacked newspapers in neat piles along the hallway, some dating back to the 1960s. The kitchen ceiling had partially collapsed, and a family of raccoons had clearly claimed the back bedroom at some point, but Ray had seen worse. He stood in the center of that living room, the afternoon light cutting through the cracks in the boards over the windows in thin golden lines, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He spent the first 2 weekends clearing debris and assessing what needed immediate attention. Marcus came by one Saturday with coffee and helped Ray pull rotted boards from the back porch. The two men worked mostly in silence, the comfortable kind that comes with years of friendship, and at the end of the day, Marcus said something that stuck with Ray. "Old houses like this," he said, wiping his hands on a rag, "they hold on to things, good and bad both." Ray laughed it off at the time, but he would think about those words again later. On his third weekend at the property, Ray started pulling up a section of the kitchen floor that had buckled near the far wall. The subfloor underneath was soft in places, and he knew he'd need to replace it before he could do anything else. He pried up the first board, then the second, and that's when his pry bar hit something that didn't sound like wood. He stopped, tapped it again. A hollow knock, different from the floor around it, deliberate almost. He crouched down and reached into the gap, his fingers finding the edge of something flat and smooth. He worked it loose, slowly, not wanting to damage whatever it was. What he pulled out was a metal box, roughly the size of a shoebox, painted dark green, sealed with a small latch that had rusted nearly shut. Ray sat back on his heels and stared at it for a long moment. His heart was doing something unusual, not racing exactly, more like it had shifted into a different gear altogether. He set the box on the kitchen counter and stood there in the afternoon quiet, sawdust still hanging in the air around him, and asked himself the question that would keep him awake for the next 3 nights straight. What on earth had Walter Greer buried under his kitchen floor, and why? Now, pause for just a second, because we want to hear from you. Before we go further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. If you're new here, click subscribe so you never miss our upcoming videos. We publish stories like this every week, real human stories about ordinary people caught in extraordinary moments. Now, back to Ray. He didn't open the box that day. He wrapped it in an old towel, put it in the trunk of his car, and drove back to his rented room. He told himself he was being careful, that he wanted to think before he acted. The truth was, he was a little afraid of what might be inside, not in a superstitious way, but in the way a person hesitates before opening a letter that might change things. Because Ray Calloway had lived long enough to know that some discoveries don't leave you the same way they found you. He ate dinner at the diner on Main Street that night, the usual, a plate of meatloaf and mashed potatoes, and the whole time he sat there, he kept thinking about Marcus's words. Old houses hold on to things, good and bad both. He left a bigger tick than usual. He didn't sleep well. The next morning, Ray set the box on his small kitchen table and opened it. The latch gave way with a dry snap. Inside, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that had kept everything remarkably preserved, was a bundle of documents. Letters, mostly, handwritten in a careful, old-fashioned script. Beneath the letters was a photograph, black and white, slightly faded at the edges. It showed a young man and a young woman standing in front of what Ray recognized immediately, the house at 412 Birchwood Lane, back when it was new. The man in the photograph was smiling in the way people smile when they don't know yet what's coming. Enclipped to the photograph with a rusted paper clip was a smaller document, a handwritten note on plain white paper. Ray unfolded it carefully, and as he read the first line, he felt the air go out of the room. The note was addressed to no one by name. It began simply, "If you're reading this, then I was never brave enough to say it myself." What followed over the course of 3 handwritten pages was a confession. Walter Greer had written it sometime in the late 1970s, based on the dates referenced inside. In it, he described a friendship, a deep, devoted friendship with a man named Daniel Calloway, who had grown up 2 streets over from Birchwood Lane. The name stopped Ray cold, because Daniel Calloway was his father. His father, who had died in a car accident in 1983, 2 years after Walter moved out of that house. His father, who Ray had barely known, who his mother rarely spoke about, who existed in Ray's memory mostly as a photograph on a shelf and a hollow feeling that showed up sometimes without warning. Ray read the letter twice, then a third time. According to Walter's account, he and Daniel Calloway had been close friends for nearly 15 years, from their early 20s through most of their 30s. Walter described the man who was generous to a fault, fiercely loyal, and struggling privately with things he didn't have the language for in that era, in that town. The letter was not a love letter in any romantic sense. It was something rarer than that. It was a document, a witness. Walter had written down who Daniel Calloway truly was in his own words so that the truth of him wouldn't disappear entirely when they were both gone. Near the end of the 3rd page, Walter had written, "He told me once that he had a son he didn't know how to reach. I hope that son finds his way. I hope he knows his father was a good man, not perfect, but good and trying." Ray sat at that table for a long time. Outside, the November wind had picked up, rattling the window in its frame. He thought about his daughter Cassie, whom he called every Sunday, but struggled to really talk to. He thought about the distance between people who love each other, but don't know how to say so. He thought about his father, a man who had been 2 streets away from the house Ray now owned, who had sat in that kitchen, who had been known and cared for by a quiet, solitary man who saw fit to seal those words in a metal box under the floor rather than let them be lost. Ask yourself something. If a stranger had preserved the truth about someone you loved,
sealed it away, and left it for you to find. What would that do to you? What would it ask of you? Ray drove back to Grover Falls the following weekend with the letters. He went to the county historical office and asked about Walter Greer. The woman behind the desk, a retired school teacher named Loretta, who had lived in Grover Falls her entire life, remembered Walter. Quiet man, she said, kept to himself. She remembered Daniel Calloway, too. Said he was the kind of person that made a room feel warmer just by being in it. Ray asked if there was anyone left who had known either of them. Loretta thought for a moment, then wrote down a name on a piece of paper and slid it across the desk. An old man named Earl Hutchins, she said. Lived out on Route 9, had known both men back in the day. Might be willing to talk. Ray folded the paper and put it in his shirt pocket, right over his chest, and thanked her quietly. Earl Hutchins was 81 years old and answered the door in overalls and a flannel shirt like he was expecting someone, but not sure who. When Ray introduced himself and mentioned his father's name, something moved across the old man's face. Recognition mixed with something older and harder to name. Earl invited him in without hesitation. They sat at a kitchen table, not unlike the one in Ray's rented room, and over 2 cups of coffee that Earl made strong enough to stand a spoon in, the old man talked. He talked for nearly 2 hours. He told Ray things about Daniel Calloway that Ray had never known, about his father's humor, his stubbornness, the way he could fix anything mechanical with whatever happens be nearby, and the private grief he carried over a son he felt he had failed to be present for. He talked about you, Earl said at one point, setting down his cup. Ray didn't say anything for that. He looked out the window at the bare November trees along Route 9 and let the words settle into him the way cold settles into an old house, slowly into every corner. On the drive back to town, Ray pulled over once on the side of the road, not because anything was wrong mechanically, just because he needed a minute. He sat there with the engine running and the heater blowing and thought about the chain of things that had led him to this point. The failed marriage, the return to Grover Falls, the $800, the condemned building, the house the whole town had given up on. He had no idea what was inside. He just knew he needed something to call his own. And what he got back was something he hadn't even known he was missing. A piece of his father returned to him 40 years too late, and somehow, against all reason, right on time. Some things wait for the right person to find them. Some truths outlast the people who carry them. And some houses, the ones everyone else walked past, are holding exactly what you need.